I'm Marcy Dinius. I'm a professor of English at DePaul University in Chicago.
Well, thank you for agreeing to talk with me. Today we're going to be talking about your book, The Textual Effects of David Walker's Appeal, Print-Based Activism Against Slavery, Racism, and Discrimination, 1829 to 1851. Could you begin by telling us how you came to look at Walker's Appeal and write this book?
Sure, it was a long time ago. I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Walker's Appeal while I was an undergraduate at the University of Notre Dame by a professor named Erskine Peters, and he introduced both me to Walker's Appeal and to Stewart's pamphlet as well in what I think was at that point, since it was a pretty long time ago, back in the 90s, a pretty early revision of African American literary history that was very interested in looking at other textual forms than just the slave narrative, which has really dominated our understanding of African American literary history. And somehow, when Professor Peters introduced me to that book, it really stuck with me, and especially the feeling, the affect in it. And it was something that I returned to in graduate school. And one day just noticed that, especially the introduction to what was then one of the most widely read editions, really profoundly misunderstood the typography and the emphasis in it. And that really just got me hooked at trying to understand more about what Walker was so unusually up to in this pamphlet that had extraordinary consequences and an extraordinary response. And yeah, it's something I've lived with for a very long time.
Yeah, I think I came to it through another book, which how we find these things is sometimes lost to memory and
It's
time.
true.
But could you start by telling us who David Walker was and just what the appeal that he wrote sought to accomplish and what it was?
Yeah, absolutely. So David Walker was a free Black Bostonian. He was born in what scholars think is North Carolina, or have established as North Carolina, and made his way to the North into a very active activist community, Black activist community on Beacon Hill in Boston in the 1820s. And he immersed himself in the political and print culture there at the time. He became an agent of Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper, and so solicited subscriptions to it and expanded its reach. He was active in the Massachusetts General Colored Association, which was, again, another Black activist political group, and gave speeches. He was also a Prince Hall Black Mason at the time. And so pretty much any opportunity to gather and speak and think with other African Americans, Walker was right in the middle of. And from this activism and from his experiences in having some of his speeches published in print, we think he decided to really dedicate himself to some extended scholarship in the interest of publishing what became David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, a pamphlet that he self-published in 3 editions between 1829 and 1830. So a pretty narrow window of time to do so much work. That was that he circulated locally in Boston, that he sent copies of himself into the South to friendly contacts that he had there, or people that he thought might be friendly contacts, and that he submitted bundles of to other supporters that he hoped would spread not just South, but across the country. And as we see in my book, that it made its way all the way out to at least Ohio, and almost surely farther than that. The appeal, because it had the radical message in encouraging enslaved people, directly addressing enslaved people and encouraging them to resist their enslavers by any means necessary, including violence to the point of lethality if necessary, occasioned quite a backlash in the South. And this resulted in some of the strictest anti-literacy and anti-mobility and anti-publishing, well, I think we could just say simply censorship laws in the South that spread pretty much like wildfire through Southern legislatures, and to try to suppress this pamphlet, and then ultimately, shortly, what followed on its heels, Garrison's Liberator, and other anti-slavery publications. And so Yeah, that was basically Walker's very, very significant impact that he had in a very small window of time. He died of tuberculosis in 1830 after a number of legislatures and governors and vigilantes put out bounties on his head. For a long time, it was assumed that he was a victim of extrajudicial violence, but it's been established that he almost surely succumbed to the effects of tuberculosis.
So before we get into how the text works and your very interesting critique of that, I'd love for you to tell us what was his main argument, and you do mention his scholarship is, kind of a reaction to Jefferson's notes on Virginia, the Constitution, and it's a very rich and complex document. So I'd love for you to tell us what he was saying and how he said it.
Yeah, I think just briefly to give a sense of the richness of scholarship and complexity in it, that Walker explains that he has surveyed really histories, the existing histories of what we would now call Western society, or think of as Western society, is certainly back to antiquity, and has discovered through his research, fact-based research, that the situation of slavery and racism in the United States was the worst that ever existed in human history. And because of that, that intense racism and that very worst form of slavery to which people of African descent were subjected to in the United States, that had led to the condition of most Black people in the United States being reduced to a situation of ignorance and abjection in other forms that was also unprecedented. But that Walker, again, wanted to make very clear that was the result of their social and legal circumstances and these historical circumstances, not the result of any kind of essential biological natural difference in people of African descent. And so that basically is his argument that he reiterates multiple times throughout the appeal so that no one can miss it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that fascinated me about the document is this call to violence, which we seem to forget was a very real threat, not only in the minds of the South, but also in the minds of the Northern, abolitionists. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Henry Garnett. But can you tell us how he structured his argument around Jefferson and this idea of not only teaching but motivating his audience? And then we can get into the textual kind of deployment of that.
Yeah. He, as you can imagine, Walker posed a bit of a challenge to himself by doing so much research and incorporating so many different sources into his text, um, because he wanted to reach the broadest possible range of audiences, including people who were enslaved, who were unable to read, who had been kept from literacy deliberately. But he also wanted to engage at the same time the very most educated African Americans at the time, as well as the very most educated white readers that he knew would also be reading. So that is really, truly the full spectrum, basically, of people living in the majority of the United States at the time. So I analyze in my first chapter how we can look to what was a very popular book of grammar, Lindley Murray's Grammar of the English Language, and how it looks that as if Walker, who cites Murray's grammar in his text, borrowed on Lindley Murray's strategy of making his main points at the very top of each section of his appeal. It's divided into 4 different articles. And in that first paragraph of each of the 4 articles and his introduction, he makes it absolutely clear what his main argument of the appeal is, and then what his sub-argument related to that main argument of the very worst form of objection possible is. And so he divides them into categories like education and the denial of education that has led to ignorance. He dedicates the longest article in the appeal to the topic of colonization, right? Sending liberated formerly enslaved peoples back to Africa, and his arguments against that. And again, these are very, very well-researched arguments, but he has this habit of structuring at least the very beginnings of each article, so that the argument basically is made there in small form. And that if for those more advanced readers, if they want to or are able to keep reading, then they can really get into the nitty-gritty of his argument, including even footnotes that he includes with citations of his different sources that he's engaging with. And so we can see in that way, he manages to maintain it as a highly researched, evidence-based, almost really truly scholarly text, but at the same time make it dissectable, excerptable for someone, say, who might be reading it aloud and who really needs to kind of hit the high marks to move that immediate audience, probably who are listening under very urgent conditions, to know that someone from the outside understands their plight, understands exactly how severe and violent and harsh it is, and especially understands, even living under those conditions, that those people have the capacity to resist and to affirm that message repeatedly throughout the text as well.
Yeah, and that we'll get back to that in a second, but let's talk about how the text is topographically, I guess, laid out on the page, and what styles and mechanisms he uses to highlight and accentuate various points. And especially, I love the "We Are Men" with the capital MEN with the many exclamation marks. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, Walker was very print savvy, and he knew the power of the visual text to especially move not just silent readers, but oral readers, readers who were reading it aloud. And so he included strings of ascending exclamation points in sentences that one sentence will have 3 exclamation points, the next sentence will have 4, then we get 5, then we get 6. So we can hear like a crescendo in his anger there, in the intensity of the statements that he's making, and that I read really as visual cues for people reading it aloud to voice it in just that way, right? And there's this moment where he asks really what we could think of as the central question around slavery and racism, which is, are we men? Are we in fact included in humanity, is really what he's asking. A debate that scientists and politicians and thinkers of all stripes took up at the time. And so he asks, are we men? And I forget if it moves across the different editions. One edition includes a question mark, and then another edition does not include a question mark, just only includes an exclamation point, so that he's already canceling the negative answer to the question, answering it affirmatively. And then the second time he answers it, he makes "Are we men?" all capital, bold capital, MEN. And so you can literally see the men rising up there in the typeface on the page, just as he's asking them to do within the content of his text.
And that, not only the way it looks on the page, but also the reading aloud, as you say, was probably done quite a bit, really had an impact that highlighted the resistance and the violence and the call to action. And that's kind of the takeaway that the enslavers will hammer down. And let's talk a little bit more about Southern reaction to this appeal.
Yes, they got their hands on it pretty quickly. Word about it circulating in their midst spread almost immediately. And you can see in the documents that historians have recovered that it's almost like governors are sending up the bat signal to each other that we found this in our state. Have you found this in yours? And what are you doing about this? A very coordinated response, because they did understand that it posed such a threat, that if people were to get a hold of it and especially start reading it aloud to enslaved people, that it could very much encourage folks on plantations to rise up, and in other circumstances too of enslavement to rise up. And of course, we can never forget this, and we can never forget this, especially now in conversations that Haiti is unfortunately back in the news, but that the specter of the Haitian Revolution was always looming in the ideas of Americans, right? Because that's, of course, an Enlightenment era freedom-based revolution that happened in the Western Hemisphere, right? And that they saw as possible to spread into North America as well, was always on their minds. And you will even see in some of the legislative record at the time behind closed doors and sessions and discussions that they're having about this, that they're saying this will basically start another Haitian revolution on our soil. And so we need to aggressively ban this. And that, again, resulted in laws on the books. And in some cases, states actually did debate it and rejected those laws and almost surely turned to extra legal mechanisms for suppressing it. But that the states that did pass these laws banned things like literacy, restricted where people enslaved and free could gather or how they could move in physical space and how they could interact with each other, because they knew, again, that communication was key and that really posed the greatest threat to their dominance.
And the impact of this appeal wasn't just Southern, it was Northern, and other abolitionists picked up this as a document to base their arguments, extend the argument, and also to react to the way it was presented on the page and the print document. So let's talk about some of the other people you talk about in the book. We'll move, I think, straight into William Apis. Is it how you said it? Okay, so describe it or tell us about who Apis was and
Sure.
about his document response.
Right. Yes. William Apis was a member of the Pequot tribe in Connecticut. He ended up in Massachusetts as people moved around a lot at the time, of course, and became active. He was first, while he was still in Connecticut, was introduced to Methodism, the wildly popular evangelical religion at the time that was spreading throughout all sorts of communities in the United States during the Second Great Awakening. And he became trained as a Methodist minister and was a minister to his people. But unfortunately, Apis was treated very differently by white members of the Methodist Church. There was a dispute about whether or not he would be licensed as an official minister. That was, as he wrote about, straight up the result of discrimination. And he, from these experiences, became pretty radicalized and fell in with a group or sought out a group of African-American activists in Boston, including Walker. And I would love smoking gun evidence that they actually encountered each other in real life, not just textually, but it seems almost impossible that they wouldn't have. It was, not a huge community, but that Apis certainly read Walker's appeal, we can see through a political and polemical essay that he included in the back of what otherwise seems a kind of innocuous standard religious pamphlet at the time. It was called The Experiences of The Experiences of Five Christian Indians, where he publishes what are fairly standard conversion stories, first-person conversion stories of, in this case, Indigenous Americans who came to find their Christian faiths. And after narrating these stories, these people of their conversions, including Apis and his own wife, there is this essay appended to the back or included in the back. I say not appended because if you read the other conversion narratives, you start to find there's already a political thread running through them. But here it comes full force in what is titled An Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man. And it is just a scathing essay about how white Christian Americans contradict themselves fully in their treatment of Indigenous Americans, and how Apis, I argue that one of the things that he that particularly signals that he read and was engaging with Walker is not just some of the similarity of the language that he uses and the similarity of the arguments that he uses, including an argument that Indigenous Americans are the most oppressed of minority groups in the United States, even more, it seems he's arguing, than African Americans. He also seems to have very clearly listened to Walker's instructions in the appeal that everyone should get a copy of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia and read it. And this is the text in which Jefferson makes extremely, extremely influential claims about racial difference between European descended Americans, Indigenous Americans, and African descended Americans. And one of the claims that Jefferson makes in Notes on the State of Virginia is that Indigenous Americans are higher on the racial totem pole, closer to whites, or maybe even in some cases equal to or even superior than whites. And Apis just latches onto this and says, if you say this here, how can you treat us as you do? And especially in combination with your Christianity, where you do not follow the golden rule that is the very heart of Christianity. And so he uses this two-pronged approach, much like Walker does, to say you don't follow your own principles of Christianity, nor do you follow your own Enlightenment governmental political principles, and therefore you are hypocrites, and I am calling you out, holding up this looking glass, as he metaphorically calls his pamphlet, right? So you can see your own reflections and see how, in fact, you embody, white Americans, the very traits that you seem to despise in other people.
Now, before we get to the reaction of the pamphlet and how its life kind of after the initial publication, talk a little bit more about how Apis doesn't really plagiarize, but kind of borrows from Walker almost verbatim, and how this is a tradition within the Methodist evangelical community.
Yes. Yeah, this is, it's not just Apis, but there's also William Paul Quinn, who is a Methodist minister that I devote another chapter to, that just even more than Apis straight lifts passages from Walker's Appeal and includes them in his own with no acknowledgement, that I really push us to rethink, not as, questions of plagiarism. And I think even our own thoughts now about AI are really encouraging us to rethink how we think about the ownership of literary or textually expressed ideas, right? That when we look at these texts, and to focus right now on Apis's, right, he's definitely borrowing specific words. He uses the word abject. He shares that frequently with Walker to describe the condition of Native peoples. He borrows some of the same arguments, but that, as you said, it's not just a straight kind of copying. It's what I call an adopting and adapting, and that there's always, we can see in that, the thing that we've historically disqualified plagiarism for, which is it's not you doing your own work, right? Apis is clearly hard at work here to borrow on really the best ideas that he's seen in Walker and some of the best ways of expressing them, but to, again, adopt and adapt them to the Native experience, which is similar, but as he insists on, also different from the experience of African Americans, and not just their experience of objection, but their ways of thinking about their humanity and their selfhood and their own potentials for agency. And so that means that he needs to, there is some resemblance to Walker, but that he needs to do some of his own work that is really coming from his own community and his own ways of thinking that really suits them as he sees more appropriately. And so there is significant effort in that form of adopting and adapting that I think has gone kind of historically under-recognized in our dominant ways of thinking about, say, original genius, right? And again, that kind of proprietary sense of our ideas that's all linked to our property-based understandings of lots of things.
Yeah, and it should be said too that Walker never copywrote his, or did not have a copyright on the appeal.
That's right.
So, correct?
Yes, in fact, I insist that he deliberately didn't copyright it because he was a textual enough creature to have seen copyright notices in other books at the time, but that in place of, very notably, where we would see a copyright notice on the verso of a title page, right, the backside of a title page, that is where he includes that specific notice to readers to be sure to circulate it by any means necessary, including reading it aloud to other people. And so that I really read that as an anti-copyright notice, right? That he's basically relinquishing ownership of this in favor of its circulation and its message and ideas spreading as widely as possible, including to people like William Apis, who, again, freely adopts and adapts it. And in just what I see, runs with this idea. It's in some ways so exciting to see these writers in the ways that they do variations on Walker's ideas is clearly getting what Walker meant, what Walker intended, right? That they were using this text in a way that kept it alive and that transformed it, that Walker would have, if he'd been able to live long enough and see this, I think would have just been delighted by.
Yeah, it's almost like ripples in a pool. So I would like to address, before we move on from Apis, the very distinct audience that the appeals and the mirror looking glass have, because it seems that they are speaking to different audiences, in their kind of same argument. So,
Yeah.
yeah, could you talk a little bit more about who Apis was talking to, specifically,
Yeah,
what they thought about it?
Apis was his big target, I think, in his essay and in the pamphlet too, was a more religiously, institutionally religious audience, I would say, specifically Methodists, people involved with Methodism and Methodist ministers and the hierarchy within the Methodist organization, basically. I would say that was largely his target audience. His specific target audience and thinking about what his grievances were, right? His grievances and other indigenous people who'd essentially been, um, through missionary efforts that they've been almost in some ways kind of colonized and abandoned by these evangelical missionary efforts. And so that's his big critique. But just like Walker too, he's willing to paint his indictment using a broad brush. And so he too, just like Walker, will speak to white people with a capitalized W, right? And when he says Christian Americans too, that's who he largely means is white people. And again, more broadly than the Methodist leadership, that it's him realizing that any white person who is thinking that Indigenous Americans are different and lesser than them, he's certainly speaking to them as well at the same time.
Well, and I really enjoyed the chapter on Henry Garnett because it speaks to us to several different um, levels of of authorship and also in just society at large.
Yeah,
So let's talk about Henry Garnett and
sure.
who he was and what he tried to write.
Yeah, Garnett is a fascinating case. So we'll remember that Walker's Appeals published in 1829 and 1830, and by that's it's really the text that incites the turn to what's called radical abolition, where the abolition movement becomes really a movement of radicals who are very engaged in spreading the cause, white and black. We get the birth of Garrison's Liberator, we get the organization of the American Anti-Slavery Society, this real upwelling of trying to force a national conversation about whether slavery is right or wrong. By the 1840s and 1850s, slavery has only expanded exponentially and it's become even more industrialized. So the kind of early political radicalism of the early 1830s, in some ways, I don't want to say has failed, but it's not been successful in thwarting slavery's dramatic expansion and its increasing severity. And I don't want to blame that on the anti-slavery movement, or movements, we should say, at all, but to say the people committed to slavery were awfully committed to it. And in some ways, the ways that slavery expanded were also responding to the effects that anti-slavery was having. This created a politically very urgent situation for folks in the 1840s and 50s. Henry Highland Garnett was fortunate enough to have been part of a family who liberated themselves from, I believe it was Maryland, and made their way north. He was one of a small group of African-American children that were educated in the New York Free School in New York City, which was an early school dedicated to the equal education of Black children, that turned out to have fostered a bunch of activists in time. He was basically an activist since he was in that school, and he became, in the Black anti-slavery movement, a real contender for its leadership, primarily contending with someone who we know much better, Frederick Douglass. And I would say, in the kind of classic way that American society works, it loves a fight among activists, especially to kind of have them take each other down. And that's really, in a way, what happened with the Black anti-slavery movement. And Douglass, in some ways, kind of won. But where the real struggle was over this. I think this urgency that Garnett felt in 1848, especially in relation to worldwide revolutions from below, that this was the moment for enslaved Americans to rise up and join these global revolutions. And Garnett realized there was no better time for the republication of Walker's Appeal. And he decided to republish a new edition of Walker's appeal after he had given a very Walker-like speech at a convention of African Americans several times. The big one was 1843, and this speech that he gave encouraged enslaved people to rise up and set themselves free. And there was significant, intense debate, fiery debate at that convention, largely the opposition led by surprisingly Douglas, who had liberated himself and who had done so using violence against his enslaver Covey, or his overseer Covey. But Douglas rather was terrified that if this message reached enslaved people, that they would act up and be just overwhelmingly suppressed. And he was afraid that this message would cause terrible, terrible harm to Black lives. And he wanted that message not to reach them. Garnett was insistent that enslaved people make that decision themselves about how to use this information. Committees led by Douglas at this convention refused to publish Garnett's speech. Garnett said, fine then, I'll publish it myself and bind it together physically with Walker's appeal. And very interestingly, in his introduction to the pamphlet, or maybe it's to his speech, I've forgotten at this point, he uses that metaphor of being bound together, freed African Americans with enslaved African Americans, and that they can never forget each other, and that their plight is intertwined, inseverable. And he does that in a book, or in a book that he has bound together, his speech and Walker's appeal, to reactivate Walker's appeal and give it new force with his own speech, again, in this era of global revolutions.
Well, and I particularly liked his argument as you laid it out, which is for this verbal confrontation and then a general strike, which,
Yep.
and then ultimately probably self-defense. So
Yep.
you talk a little bit more about that and how he envisioned his message activating that uprising.
That's right. Because he got so much pushback at not just the 1843 colored convention, but at multiple conventions, I believe another one in 1847, he had to nuance this moment where he delivers this message to the enslaved, especially when he knows that it's not just a speech that's being given rhetorically to the enslaved from a distance at a convention, and that likely wasn't going to reach them, but when it was moving into print form and could reach them. And so when he gets to that moment in his address to the enslaved of the United States of America, he says, these are the steps. I want you to tell your masters that when the time is right, you determine for yourselves the time to do this. He says, tell your masters that you will not do this, that this is wrong, and that they should not treat you this way. They will likely react violently. That violent reaction from the enslavers will be the occasion for you to use force. And so that for Garnett, when he comes to giving that step-by-step advice, it's impossible for me not to see that as very, very grounded in the labor movement at the time, which was also using similar tactics to use a work stoppage, right, or a work slowdown, and then to elicit a stronger response from, right, the employers, the oppressors, and then that would occasion a more forceful response from those seeking to resist, and a more coordinated response that would hopefully spread beyond these local moments of resistance. And so he's very strategic in that way, so that no one can accuse him of trying to foment a general revolution just from jump. It's that he wants it to be very locally determined, situationally determined. But then he also knows that even that being the case, when it's happening according to local circumstances, these are the dominoes that will fall, that you will get a violent response from the enslavers who only know how to suppress through violence, and that will be your occasion and justification to react violently yourself, very much on the model of the American Revolution, right? And appeals to liberty and grounds for just resistance at the time.
Yeah, so I think that's yeah, and I love the fact that his argument gets regulated to a subcommittee.
Yeah.
Basically, the response is, we don't know what to do with this, so we'll just create a committee to deal with it and put Douglas in charge.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see, isn't it? Even at that moment in the 1840s, that they'd already figured out how to kill things in subcommittees that were too hot to handle. Yep, and that's exactly what they tried to do.
It's kind of the argument we have seen on the left now, which, should we punch a Nazi?
Right.
And then, the whole, is violence ever justified, or is it, like,
Yeah, and that's one of the things, and I'm glad you made that comparison because that's still a relevant conversation, right? We still there are many moments of protest where there's a discussion of even protest itself now is violent. And so violence is something that's under constant redefinition. And I think it's a thing that's very fascinating to watch across these different pamphlets from, again, 1829 to all the way to 1850, what is it, 51 is Paola Brown's pamphlet, I think, that we can see them in those different moments and in those circumstances that the definition of violence and the justifications of violence are constantly on the move, constantly having to shift in relation to the circumstances of the time. And that's very much true of our own time too.
yeah, and kind of winding things up, I'd love for you to talk to us how each of these appeals following, each of these documents following the appeal made a stronger or weaker case for the connection between enslaved people in the South and free people in the North, and how also religion just permeates these. And it seems like there's I know it's the time and place where religion, but that appeal to religion seems really urgent to these authors.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start there. Religion absolutely permeates all of the texts in this book, right, that are featured as responses to Walker's appeal, and that of course starts with Walker's appeal. And that's one of the primary ways that Walker's appeal has been studied, is as a Jeremiad, really, as a for its ministerial voice that we can see Walker having, that he's preaching to white and Black Americans, right, to motivate them, move them to change, especially to turn away from their sinful ways, specifically the sins of slavery and racism. And that never falls out of the pamphlets that follow it, because both the United States and even Canada, as is featured in the chapter dedicated to Paola Brown and his response to Walker's appeal, which is published in Canada, these were dominantly Christian nations, right? This was where religion was very central to organizing people and thought and actions at the time. And it was one of the strongest arguments that all of them could use for how Americans, and to a degree Canadians, were violating their own religious principles, the principles that they supposedly held dearest. And again, every one of these authors uses that as the one plank, and then the equal and also necessary paired plank with it is the one about their political principles, right? That equality, that the very basis of what we consider like liberal individualism and rights-bearing citizens, that they're ignoring those when it comes to people of color and when it comes to women too. And so they all use that dual approach that's basically irresistible. That's something that is almost impossible for people to argue against, and that we see of course, as a result, that they turn to other means like violent suppression to try to counter, because they couldn't counter them argumentatively. Yeah. And so the second part, I think, about your question about how stronger or weaker arguments, I don't really see any of them making weaker arguments in a sense of like rhetorically weaker or polemically weaker, but I see them as modulating their arguments to reach their different audiences. So for example, the chapter that's dedicated to William Paul Quinn, who is a Methodist church missionary from the Methodist hierarchy, high up in the Methodist ranks, out in he's in Ohio, and he is which was considered the West at the time. And he's out in Ohio trying to evangelize to the incipient population out there. This is a population that maybe doesn't need, to his mind, quite as radical a message as places where racism is quite as entrenched and where society is quite as fully fleshed out as it is. And so, and again, he's coming from a position of Methodist leadership. And so the argument about violence falls a little bit out of the picture, is diminished more in that pamphlet than it is in some of the others, because again, of the circumstances that he has there. So I see that more as, again, these writers really modulating according to their circumstances and according to who they knew their audiences were. And again, too, we always need to remember that slavery and racism are extremely dynamic, and that they're extremely specific in some ways to where people are in the circumstances that they're living in. And so when we see some of these moderations, or what I, again, would think of more as modulations in the different pamphlets, that it's them adapting to their situation and their circumstances, and the audiences that they're speaking to and seek to reach and move to.
And how would you characterize the legacy of these documents in not only the abolitionist movement, but also in the historical context of the literary and
Yeah,
importance?
they've been very mixed. I would say, for example, Paola Brown and William Paul Quinn's pamphlets have gone largely understudied. They're unstudied. They've appeared in a few anthologies of African American writing, but have not gotten a whole bunch of attention beyond that. But pardon me, that Walker's Appeal has been uh, very well studied in the 20th century. It especially reemerged with a kind of vengeance in the Black Power movement of the 1960s, got republished then in different editions, and has been in pretty continuous publication, in fact, in continuous publication since the 1960s. And there were some earlier editions than that in the 20th century as well. So it's always kind of been there, but it's been a question of who was paying attention to it. I think in some ways in the scholarly world, historians were paying more attention to it as a kind of flare of potential violence that got sent up before Nat Turner's revolt, which happens in 1831, people wanting to argue that maybe it even occasioned Nat Turner's revolt. But in terms of, say, literary scholarship, it had been paid a lot less attention to. Again, the slave narrative had been largely dominant, and where people had put all of their energy. But as we've kind of expanded to look at the wealth of writing that people of African descent were doing beyond that, we've shifted to look more at the essay form and more at the pamphlet form. And so that's gotten more attention to Walker's Appeal, more attention to Mariah Stewart's pamphlet, and more to, say, the political publications that were being published. There's the Colored Conventions movement. I would be remiss not to mention coloredconventions.org is this immense online resource for looking at all of the published records of all of the colored conventions in the 19th century. And so these are ways that we see, as our kind of idea of what counts as the literary has changed, our scope for what kind of documents we need to be looking at to really understand more fully people's experiences of the past and how they dealt with them, especially through print and through language, are ways that these texts have been, I think, largely recovered. Yeah.